Now, South Africa's unemployment crisis is usually discussed in terms of growth, investment and skills, but there is another pressure point sitting quietly in the labour system. The Basic Conditions of Employment Act earnings threshold has risen to 269,600 rand a year, expanding the number of workers who qualify for overtime, for Sunday pay, night shift allowances and public holiday premiums. Now, the protection is well intended, but in labour-intensive sectors such as retail, logistics, security and healthcare, it may also be changing the economics of hiring. And let's put this under scrutiny with John Botha, Joint Chief Executive Officer of Global Business Solutions. John, welcome back to the program. Are you suggesting that worker protection is now becoming a barrier to job creation, or do you think I'm overstating it slightly?
Yes, Jeremy, and thanks for having me, and good day to you and the listeners. So my view is that these well-intended thresholds, such as the national minimum wage, this threshold now in terms of the BCEA threshold, and there are certain other thresholds that establish this sort of baseline minimum. And the net impact of this, Jeremy, is that organizational employment costs increase. And often they increase more than inflation. So what's happening here in the BCEA context is with the 269,600 Rand per annum threshold, effectively it means if you earn less than that per annum, then you are entitled to time and a half for overtime, double time for Sundays in many instances, and additional provisions such as night work allowances and the like. So all of those provisions contain an inflationary impact.
And is there evidence then that the threshold suppresses hiring rather than, as has been suggested, just raising fair labour standards?
The fact that it suppresses hiring is, let me say, it's part of a cumulative incremental process, Jeremy. So you can't look at this in isolation. It's one of the factors that contribute to it, along with other factors such as, for example, parental leave now that's being expanded to non-childbearing parents, adoptive parents, commissioning surrogates. You look at other provisions in labour law. There's always an add-on. There's never a relief in the system. So what's happening is, if you look at the compound effect, the national minimum wage increases, the overtime threshold increases, the access to parental leave increases. The cumulative effect of all of these labor laws, because they never detract, they never go one down, or they don't give much release to employers. And it's that cumulative effect on an ongoing basis in a very constrained economy and the like that I think is suppressing employment. And that's why we can't break through this employment barrier.
So is there a balance, John, between protecting workers on the one hand and not just pricing them out of work?
There definitely is a balance. And that balance is effectively struck in a vibrant economy, Jeremy. That balance is struck in an economy where the financial situation allows for that to be justified in a balanced manner. I mean, no one, even the national minimum wage at 30 Rand and 23 cents per hour is very, very, very low. But we need a point of departure. And in organizations such as you said, retail security, they often work 12-hour shifts. It's very difficult to plan because they're cyclical. Now, employers are then paying significant amounts of overtime, night work allowances, health and safety checks. And as I say, in itself and of itself, this threshold is not a bad thing. But inadvertently, it forces organizations, rather than employing, to say, how do we use artificial intelligence and rather automate all a part of this process? How do we optimize new technologies? That's the question that organizations are now asking. And of course, they're outsourcing a lot more, because when you outsource, you pay for outcomes. When you employ, you pay per hour and you pay for the labor. And that's why all these new models like, 𝗕cie𝘁𝗵𝗪, Uber, etc., those models are growing significantly because, if you employ, you're really under the hammer from an inflationary point of view.
So you talk about a point of departure. Is there a sense then that the threshold should either be frozen, maybe redesigned, should it be sector specific, or maybe linked to productivity rather than inflation?
Yes, I think the latter, Jeremy. I think more and more we need to work towards productivity-based payment. As I indicated, that's where a huge part of the workforce design is heading, is pay for performance. Pay for output. But I also think employers, Jeremy, in many instances are their own worst enemy because they're using obsolete operating models to try and operate in the new world of work. And those organizations, if you look at the cinemas, for example, closing down cinemas in flagship shopping centers. And one of the main reasons for that is they're just not pivoting, they're just not evolving. So they're still using antiquated shift systems, patterns, payment methodologies, which puts them fairly and squarely into this inflationary environment. Whereas they actually need to pivot and move with what the user and the consumer desires.
And time, I sense, is running out because, John, you've also alluded to the fact that employers are maybe using the threshold as an excuse either to automate, casualize, or cut hours. So very much that hourglass is running thin.
It is. We see the geopolitical issues. We take a look at, the labor law environment. I mean, there's a huge labor law review going through now through Parliament that will, for example, increase severance pay from 1 week severance pay per completed year to 2 week severance pay per completed year. They're tightening the screws on organizations in terms of the use of flexible labor. So if you've got 0-hour workers, in other words, I use you when I need you, and there are going to be additional protocols around cancellation penalties, etc. And that's why I'm saying this threshold is huge driver of companies re-engineering their businesses to try and move out of the space into a more competitive space. And unfortunately, the net result of that, in my mind, to your question earlier, Jeremy, ultimately the question is how can we cut the number of employees and replace that with either a different workforce model, a different remuneration model, outsource, subcontract, automate. Those are very pertinent questions in the minds of executives.
John Botha, thank you very much indeed. Joint Chief Executive Officer at Global Business Solutions.